Good morning. I'm gonna try to do my second tutorial here on probably one of the most complicated topics in the book, but I've broken it down so hopefully this is one of the easier ones for you to do, and that, of course, is what I'm talking about here with the adjacent possible. Now, my two examples, and I don't know if I'll have time to get through them because I don't want this video to drag on too terribly long. But what you're going to do for this one is you can create a presentation that illustrates a time that you experienced the adjacent possible. And trust me, I'll get to that in a little bit to help you out with that. And that's what my second example is here. Or in this, I'm hoping will make it easier for you. You can choose an example of the adjacent possible out in the real world. And that's what I did with the concept of ice harvesting. And I'm going to try to rush through this so I can talk about these more in depth. Now, when I taught this unit, what I would do is when you came to class, I had a Jenga game set up because this illustrates what the adjacent possible is all about. And what the adjacent possible is, even though it's an evolutionary term taken from science, Stephen Johnson, the author of the Ghost Map, is quoted in this book, and he's used to Newport's using this concept to talk about how you get a sense of mission, and have meaningful work. And the only way you do that is by pushing the boundaries of your field. And let me try to explain that here with the use of Jenga. Now, the whole concept of Jenga, if you don't push the boundaries, you're not going to have a game. You're just going to have a pile of blocks there. But eventually, somebody pushes the boundary. You make a guess, and you're going to put that on top. Now, this creates an entirely new set of circumstances that didn't exist before. Just because of that one little breakthrough, by taking that one little Jenga piece out, you're reshaping everything. And that illustrates what the adjacent possible is. You're creating something because you're working hard and pushing a boundary that didn't exist before. And that's what Jenga is all about. The more guesses and risks you take, the more you push the boundaries, the more enjoyable the game is. You could play it safe and not even take any pegs out, but you wouldn't have a game. You would never get to the adjacent possible by pushing the boundaries. And so you realize through trial and error, some things work, some things don't. It's easier to take the middle pegs, but if you take the middle pegs, then you limit yourself in your growth until eventually you keep going and maybe you make a bad decision and it all topples over on you. But these are all examples of little minute adjacent possibles that occur. I'll try to put that in easier context for you with an image that I've got here somewhere. Let me close my backgrounds here. There it is. Now it's craptacular. I'm sorry. I haven't done a lot of work in the adjacent possible with imagery on Word. But think of it this way. You've got a skill, whatever skill that is. Maybe if you were like me and you started playing hockey in elementary or, real early, I was great on the ice until they took the chair away. So here's me skating around with the chair. And when I got to the cutting edge, they took the chair away and I promptly fell on my face. So I never made it beyond this place in terms of the adjacent possible because I failed and I quit. But all my other friends who stayed in hockey, they put in the time and the effort, and suddenly they got good skating without the chair. And then the next skill opened up. Maybe that was actually working on their hand-eye coordination to shoot and maneuver with a stick. And then once they got good at that, they handled the puck handling and then you keep pushing the boundary. So if you want to think about this for an assignment, think about a skill that you developed early on and kept moving. I'll give you one more example of my daughter, Coco. When she passed her driver's test, her written test, she could drive with an adult. So I was teaching at the ALC at the time, and I said, all right, Coco, you're going to drive home. We were living in Red Lake Falls at the time. So she had just a very basic skill. She'd never actually driven before. And it took us about 45 minutes to get home because she never went over 45 miles an hour. She asked me to change the radio station. She had her hands planted on the steering wheel, and she even remarked, I don't know how anybody could even look at their phones while they're driving, because she had very little skill here. And sure enough, She quit about here, never got her driver's test until I think she was 21. And now she drives home from Williston, and I bet she has all of these other skills like backing up, parallel parking. But if you don't ever push those, you're never going to grow and get new skills. All right. I'll try to examine some of those some of those examples that I had. I'm going to give you one of my new examples. So close that back down. Sorry. Where is it here? Right here. So one thing I'm doing a little bit of is running each morning since the gym is closed. And so right now I could do, maybe without stopping at a decent pace, 2 miles tops, right? So the only way for me to grow and develop my skill is to train and push the boundary of that. Otherwise, if I just keep running 2 miles, I'll maybe improve my speed, but I'm never really going to see much benefit. If I keep running 2 miles at, say, 5 miles an hour, I'm just going to plateau. But if I do some training and maybe I do some interval work and maybe I try to run, instead of 2 miles, maybe I just do 1 mile at 6.5 miles, then I'm building up my endurance and I'm moving up each way until I get to a desired goal. And in this instance, I would never do this, but I think it's a great way of illustrating what the adjacent possible is. And this is a marathon training regimen. Now, how the adjacent possible works is very few people can just wake up and go run a marathon, which is 26.2 miles. Okay, very few people can do that. Instead, you have to train for it, and that's what the adjacent possible is. You're always pushing the boundaries of each circle here to get better. Because if I just ran on my treadmill and only did 2 miles at, say, 5 miles an hour, I never would develop skills. Yeah, I maybe would get better at being able to run 2 miles at 5 miles an hour, but I really wouldn't be pushing anything. I just do it over and over again. But what I love about this training regiment is, here's week 1. Monday, you get off. Perfect. I like that. Tuesday, you go for a 3-mile run. Wednesday, you do another 3-mile run. Thursday, a third 3-mile run. Friday, you get off. Saturday, you run 6 miles. And then Sunday, you do cross training. So you get 2 days of rest plus 3-mile runs and then a big one on Saturday. And then you repeat that again. You do 3 miles, 3 miles, 3 miles rest. This time you do 1 more mile. They're pushing the boundaries in each Saturday here. You're doing 1 more mile to help boost you. Then they change it up a little bit more. This time you rest on Monday, 3-mile run on Tuesday, 4 on Wednesday, 3 rest. Then you only do 5 on Saturday. And eventually it builds you up over 18 weeks that you run a marathon. Because if you just started out after week run to run a marathon, you'd maybe die of a heart attack. You probably couldn't even do a half marathon, let alone a 5K. So each week is designed to push the adjacent possible to get you to build your skills. I hope that kind of makes sense to you. Now I'll take a look at my example here, and I use literature as my adjacent possible. And hopefully it opens up here. Okay, so I started out early in life. One of my favorite people to read was Stephen King. And here I talk about, it was the best thing I ever read. I analyze it a little bit here, and then I look at the adjacent possible. It was a rip-off of an old story by W.W. Jacobs called The Monkey's Paw, excuse me. So this was me getting up against as one of the first horror novels I ever read, and it stretched me in terms of having to read several hundred pages and deal with vocabulary and stuff like that. So what happened next? In high school, I got the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, this helped because I had to deal with his difficult language that stretched me. He used his words and phrases. It's something as simple as Stephen King doesn't use. And like I said, I realized that he had a command of language and plot that King did not. So that stretched my skills. If I just kept reading Stephen King novels, I probably wouldn't have stretched myself in terms of language all that much. But Edgar Allan Poe pushed me to be a better reader. So what happened after that was in 10th grade, I got my first real novel. It was Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Now, this pushed me. It was very short. It wasn't difficult to read, but it changed me because this was the first time I started to actually understand what symbolism was and themes. And I never thought about that in terms of the work of Poe or Stephen King, but Steinbeck as kind of real literature, if you want to say that, that pushed me and really stretched me in terms of analyzing serious literature. Then my freshman year of college, Diane Drake made me read Moby Dick, which was at that time the hardest, most difficult novel I'd ever read. And she made me read it for extra credit. So I was lost half the time. I spent as much time looking up words in the dictionary as I did reading his novel. But it, again, caused me to realize something new, that this book is has a lot of biblical allusions or references. I never really picked up any allusions or references in Stephen King, Edgar Allan Poe, even Of Mice and Men. But Moby Dick, it that came out to me, and I was able to develop my skills reading that. Then later on in college, I fell in love with literature, and I still have 2 copies of this book, and it's got some of the best short stories ever. It's got The Lottery, Young Goodman Brown, of course, Hemingway, Hills Like White Elephants. Just great stuff. It's got The Storm, which we read in college comp, and I just devoured it because I developed all these skills reading these other books. If I was just always stuck reading Stephen King, I don't know necessarily that I would have grown to appreciate, quote unquote, serious literature here. And then from there, that led me into reading, of course, the greatest short story of all time, Young Goodman Brown, which I hated in college, but the more I read it and the more I studied it, had to study it, that's another pushing me out of my at the cutting edge and out of my comfort zone, the more I really appreciated it, and now I couldn't imagine not teaching it. That, of course, led me to The Yellow Wallpaper, which I tried to read. It was boring. I wasn't really ready for it yet. I wasn't ready to push that boundary or get to that cutting edge. And then I met two of my favorite English teachers, Loyal Dyrud and Larry Barton from Crookston, and we were waiting in line at lunch, and I said, "What's the greatest short story you've ever read?" And Loyal said Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway. And then Larry said The Yellow Wallpaper, which shocked me because it was the most boring story I couldn't get into. And so I went home that night and read it, and it rocked my world. Now, because of his recommendation, I chose to push my way through that story finally. And because of all the symbolism, all the other complex language, reading relatively boring literature, I was able to push my way through the first 80% of this novel and then short story, get to that final journal entry where all hell breaks loose and she's bleeding from the mouth and creeping all over the room, and just really appreciate how creepy and scary that story is. And so that's simply how I went from reading what some people say is schlock. I don't think so. I really enjoy Stephen King. But had I just kept reading Stephen King, I don't think I would have developed my ability to analyze literature quite as well as if I would have read all of this other stuff to get to the point where now I can read just about anything and enjoy it. And I'm getting good at picking out theme and symbolism and literary techniques like that. Okay, the final example I'll use is one from the real world. Now, this is simply the concept of ice harvesting, and I stole this from Stephen Johnson's example in his book, How We Got to Now. And of course, Olaf and Sven are ice harvesters. Now, ice harvesting 1.0 was the ice trade. Now, I'm going to go to, in the 1800s, the only way to get ice for refrigeration purposes was to cut chunks out of a lake and haul it to people's homes or cellars, and they used that to refrigerate food because you couldn't really keep fresh food. Whatever you butchered or harvested, you had to eat quickly. Unless you could can it or dry it like jerky, you had to eat food as you went. And so nobody here thought of pushing the envelope forward. Their idea of innovation was more horses, more tools, more lakes. Now, ice harvesting 2.0 came around when this man realized, wait a second, I can actually have technology to freeze ice. I don't need to harvest it off lakes anymore. So what we had were plants that sprung up that created ice, and we hauled them to people's homes and dropped ice off 2-3 times a week, and people had a refrigerator. Now the refrigerator then was called the ice box because you put a big chunk of ice and it melted over the course of 2 days, and then they showed up with more ice. And that way you could keep milk longer, you could keep some food longer because you were able to refrigerate it. And there's, refrigeration kind of 2.0 there. Now, that would lead to an innovation. Eventually, refrigeration. Refrigerators were born. That's ice harvesting 3.0. Because they were able to push the boundaries more and think, maybe we don't need to freeze ice in factories and haul them around. We'll create a device that will just run off electricity and keep everything cold so we can dispense with the ice. And sure enough, things have improved a little bit. I mean, you can get all kinds of devices put onto your refrigerator that allows you to make tea or coffee. You can get ones that will sync to your phone. Some I've seen that have a transparent door so you don't have to open it to look in to see what you need. But no, ice harvesting 4.0. That's the new breakthrough that we're all waiting for. And like it or not, one thing that people are looking at is simply maybe we don't need refrigerators. How about if we just have food that never goes bad? Now, that comes with a lot of negative connotations. Genetic modified organisms are dangerous, although many people would argue everything we eat today is genetically modified because whether it's through Monsanto, fertilization, cross-pollination, things like that, our foods are modified one way or another. And the idea is, what's finally ice harvesting 5.0? Maybe we'll use technology to create our food. Now, this sounds crazy, and I think it is to some extent. But at the same time, if you were to go back to when Sven and Olaf were cutting stuff out of ice and using that in cellars, and people had to butcher their animals and eat their food as they wanted to eat. You couldn't just go to Hugo's and buy a turkey for Thanksgiving. You had to raise turkeys, butcher it, and eat it that day because there's no way to keep it cold to preserve it. So if you were to take these people and show them that, I've got a refrigerator now that I can sync my phone to, they think you were crazy. But that's just an illustration of how the Jason Possible works in refrigeration. And the interesting thing is that none of these guys, their focus was so limited, none of them pushed the cutting edge because their cutting edge was more lakes, more horses, more tools. And nobody here was involved in creating this movement with the ice factories. And none of these guys, because their idea of innovation was bigger trucks, bigger factories, more ice blocks. And none of those guys were involved in creating refrigerators. And to this day, nobody here is working on genetically modified organisms because these people here are protected. Their idea of innovation is, again, let's have more refrigerators. We can't have food that never goes bad because that ruins our industry. But in order to be on the cutting edge, you kind of always have to be willing to destroy an industry to move on. Now, there are plenty of examples you could look at here. For example, what happened to Blockbuster Video? Why doesn't that exist? And if you look at that, there's a whole lot of adjacent possibles they missed out on. If I'm not mistaken, Blockbuster had a chance to actually buy Netflix, but they didn't. And that was them staying inside of their circle. If I can bring up my old image here, this is Blockbuster staying inside of their image or their circle here and not pushing the boundaries. Even if you go back and use Netflix as an example, Netflix started out not by streaming anything. You could rent videos or DVDs, or video games through the mail. That's how Netflix began. I had an early Netflix account, and that's exactly what we did. And the thing is, you never worried about late fees. You just couldn't order anything until you finally ship the movie back to them. So if you wanted to keep Return of the Sith for 8 weeks, that's fine. You just couldn't order another movie. And so once Netflix realized, maybe we should move beyond that and start streaming video, then they started moving to these new edges. And then Netflix said, well, maybe we should not worry about just allowing people to stream movies. What happens if we produced our own shows? And then they said, what happens if we let people binge them? And it keeps pushing this further and further until you get out here where Netflix is totally transforming how people consume media. I think if you were to ask a student today, would you rather go without a TV or a computer? I know my kids would say, who cares about the TV? We can stream everything online. And that is a great example of the adjacent possible. 1 million skills had to go in and innovations had to come in order to stream media. Netflix couldn't exist, nor could YouTube, when I first started teaching because there was something called dial-up internet. If you wanted to actually just download an image, it would take 8 hours because the internet speeds are so slow. But somebody was pushing the cutting edge and improved internet speeds. And then somebody came up with the movie file and all of these new, then you came up with wireless, and everything moves forward until we get to the point where now we have a brand new platform where we have Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus. Everybody's rushing online to have these streaming sources as opposed to just watching regular TV. So those are examples of the adjacent possible. Tomorrow I'll try to hammer out Little Bets and Purple Cows, which are quite easy. This by far is the most complicated one, but it's also one that's really easy to see when you look at the world around you and any of the innovations that happen, whether that's the iPhone, Netflix, what happened to Blockbuster, why don't people check out books anymore? Why do they read them on the Kindle? Even if you were to look at being able to pause TV with your DVR, all of those are great examples of the adjacent possible. All right, hopefully I didn't bore you guys to death too much. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to me and I'd be glad to help you out. Okay, I miss you guys. Love you. Thanks for listening to me. Bye.